Welcome to Reimagining Liberty, a show about the emancipatory and cosmopolitan case for radical social, political, and economic freedom. I'm Aaron Ross Powell. Today's conversation is a good one, but I struggle to come up with a straightforward summary for this intro. I brought back my good friend and frequent guest, Cory Massimino, to discuss anarchism in theory and practice. And that's where we start. But we also get into a larger conversation about the nature of political debate and the rhetoric of political change that goes well beyond the narrow confines of whether anarchism is good or bad, or what we can learn from it. This is one of those big ideas episodes of Reimagining Liberty, and why I so value talking with Cory. He's an independent scholar and a fellow at the Center for a Stateless Society, where he hosts Mutual Exchange Radio and the Long Library. If you enjoy Reimagining Liberty, I encourage you to subscribe to my free newsletter, where I write frequently about the kinds of issues we discuss on the show. And if you want to support my work, you can become a member and get early access to all new episodes. Learn more by heading to reimaginingliberty.com. With that, let's turn to my conversation with Cory. When you and I have talked about anarchism in the past, it has typically been in a negative sense. So the things that the state does are wrong. Morality says you can't treat each other in certain ways. We need to scale back and or abolish this thing called the government, etc. So it's a litany of things you're not supposed to do.
Mm-hmm.
But is there a way to present or think about anarchism in more of a positive sense?
Yeah, I think it's a good question, especially for anarchists. I think it's, like you said, so much of, I think, the discussion, a lot of the literature and the tradition of anarchism is, directed at something existing that it wants to change or abolish, and it's kind of baked into the term, unfortunately, too. It's anarchy, right? Like against rulership in Greek. So you kind of have that problem right away with the term. Sometimes we even thought about the term being maybe on the whole negative because of that, because it is just a negative vision implied. But then again, there's a whole tradition built up with the term, and it is associated with things other than negativity. In part, I think, because the negative comes out of that, the flip side, which is like, what's other than rulership then? What's the opposite of rulership, or and so from there, anarchism has a very strong tradition of offering a positive vision coming out of that. So I think that's also why you have all these like flavors of anarchism. Like the anarchism is a negative term by itself, but then that you always get these anarcho-capitalism, anarcho-communism, anarcho-syndicalism, anarcho-primitivism, feminism, etc. So the anarchists have always, I feel like, been trying to escape the negativity of that term and like appending it to some, positive vision. Okay, I support communist institutions, capitalist, feminist, etc. So I think that's kind of why you get these diverse flavors of it, where they kind of build the term that have a negative side and the positive side. So I think most anarchists see it too as like taking parts of what's existing or what we like about what exists and like expanding it further. I think we talked about that in the previous episode about anarchism. So it depends on what kind of anarchist you are, what flavor you are, what you'll look for in the existing system that you like and you want to build upon and expand the scope of, whether it's voluntarist interactions or solidaristic or maybe horizontal. Again, depending on where you come at and what you think the opposite of rulership implies and entails, and kind of how you take your positive values out of that is going to shape a lot, I think, of how you see the positive flip side of anarchism. So I think mostly, though, there's definitely a shared agreement on some broad values, like the ones that I said. At least some version of those, I think, play a big role in most anarchist thought about what a positive vision would be, and that would be expanding, for instance, voluntary institutions and replacing coercive institutions like the state and maybe some other things, depending on your views, with institutions that are bottom up, that are a product of choice and consent of the people involved. In terms of, if you see horizontality as important, then, you're replacing hierarchical institutions with horizontal ones, with ones that don't have inequality of power, inequality of decision-making, inequality of authority. So you take that to be an important sense, as against rulership too. And so you see, a lot of value on say, like, building up cooperatives or building up mutual aid societies or building up other forms of solidaristic, of horizontal cooperation. So I think that's a kind of a broad answer, and maybe isn't detailed enough for you, but maybe we can get into that more.
To what extent do anarchists see the things that you just listed off? So voluntary organizations, mutual cooperation, mutual exchange, breaking down of hierarchy, etc., as existing in opposition to the state and the state-run alternatives to those things. And what I mean by that is this something where they say, look, if we didn't have the state, then we could do these sorts of things. But because we have the state, in addition to maybe the immorality, the basic immorality of state action on anarchist grounds, we can't do those things. The state precludes these alternatives. Because one thing that came to mind as you were listing these was, we certainly do not live in an anarchist society here in the United States or really anywhere in the world. And yet people cooperate all the time. People operate. There are hierarchies, but there are also places where people interact without hierarchies. They look out for each other. We, in fact, do have voluntary institutions and so on. And so it seems like you've listed all these things that are positive. There aren't a lot of people who are like, I hate voluntary institutions and cooperation. There might be some misanthropes out there, but that's, but that doesn't seem to necessarily commit me to anarchism.
Sure. Well, I think that kind of comes back to questions of everyday morality and intuitions, and how those either map on or don't to whatever your ideology is. The more radical, the more it seems like there's a divergence. But then again, so many radicals throughout time have argued, like, no, I'm just taking the roots of common sense morality, the thought that's already in the air, and taking it to its logical extreme and taking it further. And that's how I think many progressive improvements in history have been made, like the abolition of slavery or gender equality. Things like those things are taking maybe seeds that existed earlier, and a lot of people seem like, oh, well, those have to be balanced out by these other things, and you can't extend those so far or to all of society. And then we did, or nearly so, depending on which thing you're talking about. There's always room for progress on all these dimensions. But yeah, so I think anarchism at once is very rooted in common sense morality. Like you said, no one really opposes voluntary cooperation and equal decision making, I think, completely. But then, there's cases, and then other things outweigh those values, or those values are sacrificed for some other perceived gain that maybe, is worth discussing. But still, at some point, those get sacrificed, and other things, hierarchy or rulership or coercion, become relevant. And so then those have shaped many of our institutions broadly as a society. So I don't think people, yes, it's good that anarchism speaks to, I think, something that everybody kind of says they support, and definitely do in many, or maybe in most cases. But then I think anarchism wants to take it further and wants to say, no, like, we would be even better if we took it to this degree, or applied it in this case, or abolished slavery completely, or brought about equality of gender completely. Like, these aren't just values to be sacrificed or traded off at some point in some broader calculation or decision making.
I have to ask, because they're very vocal online, and people, listeners who pay any attention to, say, the libertarian movement have probably heard of them a lot. It seems like there are a lot of anarchists who don't fit the mold that you just laid out. Like, we'll call them the pro-hierarchy, pro-private coercion anarchists who seem to see the state less as a barrier to mutual cooperation, flattening of hierarchy, moral equality, and more that the state is the thing that is preventing them from instituting racial, ethnic, nationalists, even if that seems to exist in weird tension with anarchist ideas, hierarchies, that they have a particular kind of lifestyle that is about domination by certain groups, namely them, and the state is this kind of counter-revolutionary tool of institutionalized wokeism that is the thing stopping them from instantiating that in the world.
Okay. Well, I do just have to say, before speaking directly to your question, at first I thought, like, just the beginning of what you were saying, I thought you were going to bring up kind of the opposite end of the anarchist movement, which are like probably anarchists that maybe place things like violence and negative destruction to center to their goal. But that could be another topic. So it's funny that you went in a totally different direction that I wasn't expecting. But yeah, well, I think this is I mean, every ideology has its, infinite permutations and factional disagreements. I think it's particularly stark when people take anarchism in those directions. Nationalists trying to synthesize nationalism and anarchism, for instance, or elaborate systems of private coercion that maybe nominally aren't a state or don't count, or maybe don't count as a state according to a certain metric, but still are involved in coercion or things like that. So yeah, I think part of this too is, again, in the open-endedness of anarchy, of against rulership. It's negative right there. So then you can fill in the gap however you want. What is opposed to that? What is the positive vision that you get out of that? And so I think it would be kind of weird if there were nobody who took, well, okay, against rulership. Well, what if we framed, values like equality and dignity and voluntarism as rulership, as people who like those values forcing everyone else to abide by them and ruling over us when we would otherwise be coercing people, like you said. So yeah, I think that that's obviously at some point, I don't think those views count as genuine anarchism anymore. Because what do you count as rulership? I mean, can be completely distorted and corrupted, I think, by what other values you hold or ideology you have, and you just frame it as against rulership, and I don't think that is enough to make it genuinely anarchist. I think it's unfortunate that the term and some of the good ideas of anarchism get hitched to those wagons. But yeah, I think it's a problem that afflicts a lot of ideologies, and anarchism could be especially prone to it.
On taking that in the other direction, then, there are a lot of non-anarchists who are very firmly committed to the values that you have set out to, moral egalitarianism, the flattening of hierarchies,
sure,
cooperation, voluntary institutions, and so on, but say, look, Cory, we want that too, but the way that you get that is not to abolish the state. In fact, abolishing the state gets you to the bad forms of anarchism we just talked about. It gets you to domination and hierarchy and institutionalized power in other particular, powerful and corrosive ways. And in fact, what we need, the rise of democracy and the liberal state is what has enabled us to achieve those things and to set aside the hierarchies of the past. And so you're basically calling for the abolition of the very thing that makes your positive vision of the world feasible.
Yeah, I think that's a good question, and that's a very interesting viewpoint. And ultimately, people who agree, like you said, with the empirical matter of the national anarchists, or whatever you want to call them, that the state is like this bulwark against these other forms of power. But so then they're thankfully opposed to those other forms of power. So then they just kind of end up settling for the state. And so I don't think that's a crazy view, looking at broad swaths of history, and especially in various isolated instances. The state has been a bulwark against maybe some other private objectionable form of power. But I think what we want to do is not just look at isolated instances, but the tendencies of certain institutions, maybe not inevitable, but nevertheless the incentives inherent in them, and also to not, because I think at best with these views they settle for what is an objectionable form of power and coercion, and it's not really an alternative to those things. I think it's those things concentrated. In some ways, it's those things restrained, and that's why probably some sort of constitutional restrained democratic state, is preferable to a lot of forms of private, nominally non-state, maybe like tribal or some other sort of system of governance that ultimately will be even less anarchistic in terms of the actual power that people hold over others in everyday situations. Now, why is the restrained democratic constitutional state, why can that, if it really is those things to some degree, why can that be preferable to all those other forms of private power? I think that's because the democratic constitutional state, and this goes to earlier about the seeds and common sense morality of anarchist ideas, and that's because, like a lot of anarchists have argued, the great achievement, comparatively speaking, of the democratic constitutional state is that it's built in to the state a level of polycentricity and decentralization that had never been seen before in earlier monarchies and more centralized systems of states. So I think, again, it's a matter of hoping and imagining that these principles can be taken further. Let me explain what I mean by that more. We learn it, in the United States, we learn it in like elementary school, the three branches of government, the division of power, separate powers, all that stuff. And anarchists are often right to talk about how those things can be like surface level window dressing that conceal forms of power and violence inherent in the state. And it can be those things because people use them to dismiss criticisms of the state. But those things are also, to a certain degree, actual practices and processes that states, to varying degrees, abide by and are constrained by and are held to by the people they govern over. So I think that the reason the democratic constitutional state is probably so far the least bad form of the state, I still wouldn't want to settle for that, because I still see those principles as being able to be applied further in their scope and expanded. There's a great essay by Roderick Long that you can Google called "Market Anarchism as Constitutionalism" that shaped my thinking a lot in this regard. And that is, yes, the Constitution of the United States, and of governments, anarchists wouldn't see playing a role in an anarchist society, even if it could be useful here and now to restrain states. But they do see the power being divided further into more decentralized, more polycentric, more holders of power dispersed and leveled throughout society. And so I think insofar as you have a monopoly, you can have as many branches and divisions of that monopoly as you want, and that'll probably be better than having no branches or divisions. But I'm not convinced that it wouldn't be better than having further branches and divisions, no monopoly on these services that the state provides. And so I think that would be anarchism take its conclusion. The society of private power and coercion and tribal warfare, I guess, I don't think that's genuinely anarchist. Now, maybe it doesn't have a state like we've come to know it, but it could be worse in other ways. And it would be unfortunate if it turned out that the state was genuinely a bulwark to that. But at best, that would just be settling for the private mafia and still doing everything you can to restrain it and hopefully outmode it in some way, because you wouldn't want to settle for it.
It seems then that one way to approach this open question of basically, how well would anarchism work compared to the state in advancing this shared set of values is to view it as a gradual process with uncertain conclusions. So we can say, look, decentralization, as we have decentralized, and I think you're right that like democracy and then multiple branches of government, those all represent movements in the direction of decentralization and away from, say, like North Korea is a much more centralized state than the United States is, but we can imagine an even less centralized one, is to keep going in that direction and see how it works. And if a step in that direction produces even better results, it gets us even more of these things that we value, then we stick with it. But if we get to a point where it seems like, oh, we've now clearly gone too far, we've scaled the states back so much that we're no longer getting, it turns out we're not getting more equality, flattened hierarchies, good things, and instead we're getting warlords and reinforced hierarchies and whatever, then to just say, okay, we've hit our end point. And so anarchism is kind of an aspirational, or it's an asymptotic process. You can get closer and closer, but you never quite hit it all the way. Is that an acceptable way to think about it from anarchist first principles, I suppose? Or is it rather, no, look, this thing is the very nature of the state fundamentally is immoral. It violates moral principles that we hold to. And so that looks less like, let's figure out what the optimal distribution of power or optimal spread of institutions is, and more like someone saying, hey, let's go slow on abolishing slavery. And if we get to a point where, we've abolished it so much that the plantation owners can't keep up with their bills, maybe we, stop there.
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't know. Maybe it depends on what mood I'm in when I make up which of those polls I'm attracted to. Because I'm still not sure that they're necessarily conflicting, but I guess I would say that because slow and gradual is all we've got. It's all that establishing these democratic constitutional governments had going for them too. It was a slow, gradual process of new values, of new organizations, of new institutions emerging, all kind of together and in concert, reinforcing each other. And I kind of just think that's how any social change has to happen. So I think we're stuck with that. Whatever you want, whatever your positive vision is, anarchist, what flavor of anarchist, non-anarchist, you've got slow, gradual change. And even if you imagine that's not the case, that you can just pull the lever of the state and do it, which I think a lot of political philosophy falls into. Or if you further imagine, and a lot of anarchists will fall into this, I'll pull the lever of revolution, whatever that is. Nevertheless, those are, even if those were fine and risk-free and didn't like even if that were the case, you still have to gradually build to where enough people held the values of revolution or believed something strongly enough to revolt over it, or to build up values to pull the lever of the state to modify the state in some way, to put the right people in charge of the lever, etc. And in each case, it's putting the right people in charge of the lever. And that's the part where I think they kind of are doomed to suboptimal results. So, yeah, I think anarchists would say the state, yeah, it's inherently immoral. I think it's probably even inherently inefficient compared to viable alternatives. But then I would say we're still stuck just trying to outmode it slowly. If I could, it's almost incoherent. There's always this talk of Rothbard's button for years. And it's a really fun thing to discuss. Like, what if you could just press a button and like abolish the state like instantaneously? And you could, this has ramifications beyond just this question. You could just take the Rothbard's button and apply it to anything you don't like, or any systematic domination or instance of anything, and think about it. And I think ultimately what you come to, though, is that's incoherent of a thought experiment. Like, if we abolish the state, what does that mean? The buildings are they still there? Do the people occupying them still believe what they believe? They still have free will to go back to work the next day, doing what they were doing when the state just reestablished itself? What is this? There's no coherent version of changing society overnight. And this is where the positive vision question is difficult for us all. Tomorrow has to come out of today, but we're always trying to imagine like a tomorrow that's different from today. And so there's this kind of dissonance, and I think slow and steady is the only, I think it's the only ultimately viable option. And so I think leaning into that is good too, as opposed to trying to bring about spontaneous, instantaneous revolution or immediate replacing of all institutions with whatever your preferred set of institutions are. And so this makes even a positive vision kind of open-ended and maybe vague and uncertain. And that can be a strength in this way, because I don't know. It almost seems non-anarchist to believe in a philosophy that just sort of says, well, tomorrow it'll work this way, and these people will do this, and it'll be changed in all these micro details. It's like, well, that's not really the point. You're missing the point. If that's, you're thinking like, Adam Smith's Man of System, like society's a chessboard. So that can't be any coherent way to think about social change, and it's not even in spirit with anarchist values and visions, and what's appealing ultimately, I think, morally, about anarchism, which is an open-endedness for people to experiment and experiment with whatever maybe positive vision they want to experiment with. A lot of people try to frame anarchism as this ultimately neutral thing where it's just everyone can experiment with whatever positive vision they want, right? I think there's a severe detriment to that when you start to, again, you open the door. Well, what if your experiment impedes on mine coercively, or in a form of rulership, or like you said, those almost pro-coercion kinds of flavors of anarchism. So I think it's kind of a balancing act.
How do we think about the rhetorical advice that flows out of that discussion? So we take Rothbard's button, which is you can push this button and it will abolish the state and we'll have anarchism immediately. And what you are saying is, first, that button doesn't exist. That's not a live option for us. But we could also say, even if it were a live option, it probably would be unwise to push it, because the overnight abolition of the fundamental governing structures of our society would probably not be utopia, but might be chaos. And so a gradual thing is both the only thing that's available to us and the wisest option. Okay.
Can I stop you there? Because maybe I gave you the impression that I view it as an incoherent question. I wouldn't go so far as to say it's just like obvious. Even if it was coherent, it's obviously wrong. Because like you said in your question, I mean, what about when we apply this to things that we have pretty nearly abolished, like slavery? Like, there would have to be such a degree of chaos for someone to not push the button for slavery that it's hard to imagine. I think sometimes, to put it this way, does justice demand we let the heavens fall, and or do we just let slavery continue on and continually morally taint us? Maybe sometimes justice demands the heavens fall, but maybe other times not. There would have to be and I would have to be certain that abolishing slavery immediately, if that was a coherent option, I have to be like really certain that the alternative would be like really worse. So that's kind of a vague answer, but I just wanted to clarify, because I still don't want to commit entirely to, even if it was coherent,
Sure. No, that's a helpful clarification, but I think it still leaves open the direction that I was headed.
Yeah, go ahead with that.
There's a way to discuss these ideas as what ought we to do right now, and then there's a rhetorical side of that, of even if we ought not to do them right now, how should we talk about, how radical should we be in the language that we use about them? And I think this parallels a lot of contemporary debates in, say, we could parallel to contemporary culture war issues and kind of intra-liberal conflicts over, say, like transgender rights, which is, there are people who are like, look, I'm in favor of getting us to a society where there's like radical transgender acceptance, but we have to take it slowly for a variety of reasons. Social change that happens too quickly can provoke reactionary backlashes that make us worse off than we were to begin with, or there are unknowns that we should suss out and not rush too hastily into. There's this set of arguments. And so they say, stop demanding rapid change, stop speaking in such radical ways, and instead be in your rhetoric preaching a more moderate pace. That's one argument. The other argument you might make is, look, status quos are by nature sticky. They're difficult to change. And they will always, basically the status quo will always take less than what you demand. If you demand radicalism, you're not going to get radicalism. You're going to get a slower change of pace, assuming the status quo does start going in your direction. But what that also means is that if you demand moderation, you're going to get something rather less than moderation. You're going to get either stasis or much slower progress than you wanted, or that the moderates are asking for. And so from a rhetorical standpoint, even if you think that gradualism is the only possible way to proceed, or is the wisest way to proceed, you should still be speaking in the starkest, most radical terms, like demanding the perfect version, because that's the only way you'll get any degree of movement. And the problem with those two sides is it's not just that they disagree with each other, but basically, if the one that is wrong is dangerous, in the sense that if the moderates get us to talk in the language of moderation, and what that results in is an unjust status quo persisting much longer than it otherwise would have, that is a genuine harm to the people who are suffering from those injustices. But if the radicals are wrong, and it turns out that talking in radicalism has the effect of moving us backwards, provoking reactionary backlashes, then that is a genuine harm inflicted upon people who are hurt by that reactionary backlash. And so this seems like a really weighty question.
Yeah, that's a great framing of the issue. Yeah, and it's a very important question. One I've kind of wrestled with for as long as I've kind of been doing. I don't know if activism is the right term, I guess, but like a decade in, like, in and around libertarian movements, and in some way thinking, if only the world could be a little more like this. So it's definitely, and I've kind of just come to hate the whole discussion, though, and I just sort of have these meta concerns with the framing, which are, I have no idea which one is correct. I think there's interestingly plausible arguments for each side you just presented. And it's really hard to, like, empirically determine. And it's always plagued people interested in social change, and always will. But I just think it's a waste of time, because one, we don't know, and it's like trying to centrally plan social change is the way it makes me feel sometimes, like, or like trying to game the system, or almost like overthinking the whole thing. And instead of just like saying what you think. So maybe three objections on the meta level, but two is that the interplay of what people actually think and the exchange of ideas that goes on there can be useful. Just like experimentation in other realms of, like, the sciences, or like markets, or any progressively ongoing system of discovery and knowledge. Like, social change is like those things. So like the experimentation and interplay itself might just be kind of inherently useful and generate things that we wouldn't get if everyone just like agreed, like, oh, we'll just say these things, like, and all agree on, pretending to believe that. So that's like the second thing. So it might just be useful to have whatever, people call it infighting, factionalism, like all these punching left is a big one on the left. And it's weird because I agree, I think, with the people who are like perceived as being the further left people being punched. Like I agree with them a little more substantively, but I hate the framing of like if that's what that person really thinks. If they disagree with you, then they should say that. And that gets to my third objection, which is just like trying to game the system this way ultimately disrespects our conversation partners, I think, because there's a level of honesty, I think, that is assumed and completely warranted and morally obligatory in conversations about the right policy or the right value or the good or the future or really anything. I mean, there's some level of honesty I think that we need to have in interacting and conversing with other people, and especially in these important topics. And I think people overthink it and get it into where they just sort of like hide their beliefs when talking to other people or are intentionally vague. And that is to me is a way of instrumentalizing your interlocutor. Like that is not on the up and up. And that's and it weirdly also makes you immune to like discovering new and better arguments that might force you to update your views or change your views, because then you're just closing yourself off. Like it's just, I assume they're wrong. I assume my society is like the one that needs to win out, and then this is the best like strategy to get there, which is essentially to trick them into thinking you believe X when you actually believe Y. So I don't know which strategy is better, and I'm increasingly, as the years go on, less inclined to think it matters, and to just speak honestly, because that doesn't mean you have to speak rudely or hatefully, or dismissively. If anything, it's that other view I described, right? That's kind of implicitly dismissive without letting your interlocutor know you've already dismissed them. So just speaking honestly about what we think and is good enough, I think.
This was something I've been thinking about a fair amount recently, because I was noticing the ways that I think I have intellectually changed over the years. And one of them is when I was an undergrad and then early on in my think tank career, the way that I approached political philosophical debate, the framing that I had in my mind was combativeness, was conflict, was like it's debate and argument framing. Like you and I disagree, Cory, and so my job is to win that disagreement by identifying holes in your defenses and exploiting them and bulking up my own arms. And I think there's an argument that, and then you do the same, and we pick fights with each other on the internet and fight it out. Not that you and I ever did this, but like that was kind of the thinking. Is that was the way that intellectual engagement in these areas happens, and I can tell a story about how that is a wise strategy. And the story goes something like, it parallels falsifiability in scientific development, that the way that you achieve truth in these issues is by subjecting every position to the most withering critique you can muster, and if it fails against those critiques, then you set that position aside in favor of some alternative that has not yet suffered such defeat. And this, in science, here's this scientific theory. Now we've poked holes in it, so that one's been falsified, but this one hasn't yet, but maybe someday it will. And here's another one. And that the combativeness is necessary to basically do that process well, because if I'm combative and I want to win, then I'm going to be putting a lot of focus, attention into finding those holes, noticing and exploiting those holes in your argument. So I'm more likely to knock your argument down than if I'm just kind of were sharing what's on our minds. And I think there's some degree of truth to that, but it does seem like a lot of that and a lot of kind of combative radicalism, but also combative moderation, like what we call like reactionary centrism, um, is more just dispositional. It's more just like I enjoy picking fights with people, or I enjoy the feeling of being like the wise one in the room. And I think for a lot of moderates, it's this like moderation is a sign of just being like wise and reasonable. And radicalism is necessarily a sign of being unwise and not reasonable. And you enjoy that status that comes with it. There's also a status that comes with being a defender of the status quo that I think is very powerful. And so it's ultimately not about truth seeking. It's more about just dispositions and enjoying picking fights on the internet or elsewhere, and realizing how much I've kind of lost. Like this show, I don't debate people on this show. I've had people on who I disagree with profoundly on matters of great importance to me, but the approach is more about I want to understand, and the probing is less about like winning and more about, we disagree deeply, but we're both really smart. And that's interesting then that we disagree, like we're both informed, and it's and so the fact that we disagree is interesting. So let's try to clarify where the points of disagreement are and make sure we're not misunderstanding each other and so on. And so this is a bit orthogonal to what we had been talking about, but I just think that the combativeness plays this huge dispositional combativeness, or a kind of like dismissive non-combativeness too, of like your ideas aren't even worth engaging with. You're just these like silly kids protesting on college campuses, or uninformed compared to me because I'm defending the status quo, or whatever it happens to be. I just am like noticing that so much of our political debates aren't about the truth seeking, but instead just about kind of, I want to feel a certain way as a participant in these debates.
Yeah. I think, well, here's a list of 10 fallacies you just used. No, I did just speak to kind of the generative interplay of ideas mingling, and sort of to what you said, like the rivalry of them. That's exactly how Don Lavoie also defended markets, like as this interplay of rivalry of testing, competing hypotheses over the best use of scarce resources, right? That's what markets. Anyway, but nevertheless, I think marketplace of ideas, and I think that stuff can be kind of a useful but strained metaphor, and also context is everything. And just like I was saying before, like, I think honesty is paramount and gets lost in some of those really like meta discussions over like how do we like move the Overton window like as much as we can. Like context is everything. So I think honesty gets underrated in these discussions of how to move the Overton window as far as we can. But that doesn't mean like every discussion you just, I don't know, like throw up on the table like all your extreme, most radical views and opinions that you hold about everything. Like two people are talking about the right, I don't know, like foreign policy on X, Y, or Z, or the right trade policy, and you come in and say, well, the state should be abolished, and like actually you're all wrong, and like we need to do all these extreme things. And like that, and so that's like that could be like a version of like you're being honest, but you're not like appreciating context or again like really engaging with your interlocutors in any real way if you're not even kind of in the same realm of discourse. So it doesn't require dishonesty, but at all. Like, I think that's the mistake in the opposite direction. But just being like acontextual and just almost like you said, like this social positioning, game of social positioning, rather than trying to understand or trying to help them understand your viewpoints without just like asserting a bunch of like radical opinions isn't the same as like getting to understand like your view on the world necessarily. And there's ways of doing that within like the broader language and not just like intra-anarchist lingo or terminology or views that don't seem to convey much about your values to someone who's not already part of that discussion and tradition. So yeah, I think that the generative interplay of all these things is really important, and kind of what you said had me thinking, like it is useful, especially in science, this rivalry and which hypothesis can win out. But that's not really the form of these political discussions, right? It's and it's almost combativeness is a way of like you're not even offering a hypothesis of your own to be disproven at that point. You're just defining yourself to your ideological opponent in a certain way and constraining yourself and not offering up anything to be, you're just combative, you're just disagreeing, you're just offering a negative vision, to go back to that. So that kind of approach doesn't even like achieve what you want. I think the issue is in science, the hypotheses and the issues are so discrete and in visions of, the future, of disagreements about the nature of the good, it's total opposite. And it's hard to just like test like one specific hypothesis like in isolation from the rest, like against another one in like a 30-minute debate. In ways I think it might be more amenable with like discrete scientific problems and experiments. And I'm not a scientist, but that's my sense of it. With when we try to just map that on like exactly like that to political philosophy and moral philosophy and questions of institutions and these things, it's like bound to go wrong because it's just not that discrete. We have to have these broader scope discussions of like that are trying to achieve, like you said, mutual understanding, I think. And then in the broader sense, we can kind of get, a vaguer but still useful generative interplay. And again, maybe not have like test hypotheses, so discreetly and like isolated in a single debate, but in a broader sense, people with differing views of the future or views of the good or just institutions, et cetera, can kind of understand each other and develop further. So
yes, that seems right. And I think that does get at the difference here between political engagement and scientific engagement, in part because I'm struck sometimes by there's a survey that goes out. I don't think it's every year, but it's fairly regularly, of surveying professional philosophers on their views on different philosophical topics. And so these are academic philosophers with PhDs in philosophy. So they know they're quite well informed about the spread of positions one could take on any given issue. They've heard the arguments for the various sides and so on. And yet, I think when it comes to like moral philosophy, but this is represented throughout a lot of the different views that they break out. If you poll, do you think virtue ethics is right? Do you think consequentialism is right? Do you think something like deontology is right? It's basically 1/3, 1/3, 1/3 across them, which is a very weird finding if in fact one of these things was true and therefore the others was not true. Because in lots of other areas where if you polled 3 explanations for why we get sick with doctors, the germ theory is going to come out on top by a rather wide margin. And so what that tells me is that there's something that the nature of philosophical debate is not quite as clear as the nature of scientific debate, for I think the reasons there's not these like testable, discrete things. And it's more of like, I've increasingly come to think that a lot of these arguments are like, this might upset, people who are committed to other views, but I think it's more of like kind of what works for you. And the way that you persuade philosophically and in political philosophy is by finding the arguments that are compelling to the person you're seeking to persuade, as opposed to destroying their existing argument and telling them to replace it with the one that happens to appeal to you. And, like you and I, we should talk at some point about objectivism, but like you have a much higher opinion of Rand's arguments than I do. But I think a lot of that is like, there's something that just doesn't work for me about the way that Rand approaches arguments and the way that like kind of the worldview that she's and so even if I couldn't necessarily poke holes in the discrete arguments, I probably still wouldn't accept them because it doesn't work for me. And then I have views that probably feel the same way for you. But it does feel like in the political arena, we're not in science. Science is political in its own ways, and scientists will hold on to views for political career reasons, so on. But by and large, it's much more truth-seeking than in politics. And so I guess, yeah, my like lack of combativeness is less about we shouldn't try to have meaningful debates over things of great importance. Political philosophy matters a lot. The political institutions that we have in our society matter a lot. Moral philosophy, like what we consider to be right or wrong, matters a whole lot as far as the effect on people's actual lives. But it's more about like our actual motivations for engaging in these and what we are seeking when we enter into these debates. And are we seeking to win? Or are we seeking to try to discover truth? And I think combativeness is and shutting off the dialogue, which is what you were talking about earlier, like dismissing before you even hear out the position, is a sign of not actually truth-seeking, but instead just kind of enjoying, for sometimes like less than admirable reasons, the process of fighting about political ideas.
Yeah, I mean, well, I guess I'm almost tempted to like draw a parallel to tie it back to the beginning. Like we have a negative vision, we're against combativeness, but what's the positive one? And it's almost like anarchism. We're being against combativeness is really open-ended, and so I do agree with the bulk of what you're saying, but still, context is so important, and there are like just like there's nationalist anarchism or pro-coercion anarchism or whatever oxymoron you want to use. I think there is like discourse is tricky, and I think you would agree. Obviously, there's views that you would just dismiss and you wouldn't legitimize or like entertain in like a real way. And so I guess my mind always goes there when we sing the praises of non-combativeness and mutual understanding. And obviously, I just did that. But then it's also interesting, right? To like, what are the hard cases? What are the edge cases? Like, what in like practicing this are we like actually like undermining broader values that we like care about, or maybe even those very values themselves? I think by legitimizing or entertaining certain viewpoints and quote unquote marketplace of ideas. One of them just obviously being like that combativeness is good and like dismissiveness is good in general, right? Like you would, well, I'm not really going to entertain that view, right? That's a non-starter. So like we already have one, just like anarchism says coercion's a non-starter. So yeah, I mean, I broadly agree. And then, we get on social media, right? Each of us, and then we see someone and then we're like, probably fine to dismiss that person. Like maybe we're not obliged to every single person to hear out. But yes, obviously, especially in these kind of contexts, like your show, I think does a great job with this, and I try to emulate, a very similar kind of attitude on when I've hosted, say, Mutual Exchange Radio, the C4S show I've done. So, yeah, when you have a context like this, obviously, within a certain realm, especially probably if you've already reached out to someone for a conversation, you've already decided they're within that realm of worthy of being taken seriously and entertaining their views as part of the discussion. And I guess I'm privileged to, you implicitly deem me and my views as part of the discussion. So that's great.
Thank you for listening to Reimagining Liberty. If you like the show and want to support it, head to reimaginingliberty.com to learn more. You'll get early access to all my essays, as well as be able to join the Reimagining Liberty Discord community and book club. That's reimaginingliberty.com, or look for the link in the show notes. Talk to you soon.